It is February 1988, and the car sitting in the McLaren garage at Imola does not work. Not in the way a racing car needs to work. The Honda RA168E engine produces somewhere between 1,350 and 1,500 horsepower in qualifying trim. The exact figure depends on which engineer you ask, and most of them won't say, but the chassis it sits inside is generating an aerodynamic signature that John Barnard's replacement, Steve Nichols, cannot fully explain. The undertray is producing a suction force at high speed that the simulation data did not predict. The car is faster than the model said it should be, and nobody in the garage is entirely sure why. That uncertainty, that gap between the data and the reality, is the beginning of the most dominant season any constructor has ever produced in the history of Formula One. Not the most dominant by a small margin, by a margin large enough that the sport's governing body responded by changing the fundamental rules before the next season began. What you are about to understand is not just why the McLaren MP4 was fast. It is why it was fast in a way the sport had never seen before, and why the single most important decision that shaped it was made not by an aerodynamicist, but by a team principal sitting across a table from a Japanese executive. This is the McLaren MP4. In 1988, it started 16 races and won 15 of them. Its two drivers finished first and second in 12 of those races. It secured the Constructors' Championship with 6 rounds remaining. The car that finished second in the championship scored 110 points. McLaren scored 199. And then, at the end of that season, the engine configuration that powered it was banned forever. This is how it happened. To understand the MP4, you have to understand what Formula One looked like in 1987, and specifically what it looked like from inside the McLaren garage. The turbo era was ending. The FIA had announced that turbocharged engines would be banned at the close of 1988, and in the meantime they were being strangled by regulation, a pop-off valve that limited boost pressure to 4 bar in the race, and a fuel allocation that dropped from 19.5 litres in 1987 to 150 litres for the final turbo season. The rule architects believed this would neutralize the turbo advantage and give naturally aspirated cars, which were exempt from the fuel limit, a genuine shot at competitiveness. It did not work out that way. What it actually created was a single technical question: which team could extract the most performance from the least fuel at the most restricted boost pressure over the longest distance? That question, as it turned out, had exactly one correct answer. McLaren had answered it before it was asked. In the summer of 1987, Ron Dennis negotiated an agreement with Honda that would prove to be one of the most consequential commercial deals in motorsport history. Honda supplied Williams, the 1987 Constructors' Champions, and Lotus. What exactly went wrong between Honda and Williams that year remains diplomatically obscured, but the outcome was unambiguous. Honda ended the Williams supply agreement and signed an exclusive deal with McLaren. Exclusive is the word that matters, not preferential. Exclusive meaning every Honda engine in Formula One in 1988 would go to McLaren, and every other team would face them without the most powerful unit in the paddock. Williams went from champions to Judd-powered also-rans in a single off-season. Honda had spent 3 years refining the RA series through race use, accumulating reliability and fuel consumption data that no rival could replicate over a winter. When the lights went out at Phoenix in March 1988, every other team was already 6 months behind. But engine advantages in Formula One are not self-executing. You still have to build the car around the power unit, and in the winter of 1987 to 1988, McLaren faced a problem they had not anticipated. John Barnard, the designer responsible for the MP4 lineage, the man who had pioneered the carbon fiber monocoque in 1981, had left for Ferrari. The MP4 would be designed in his absence, with overall direction from Gordon Murray, recently arrived from Brabham, and detailed chassis work led by Steve Nichols. Murray brought with him a design philosophy Barnard had never fully shared, an obsession with minimizing frontal area and lowering the car's center of gravity beyond anything previous McLarens had attempted. Murray's instinct was aerodynamic, grounded in a specific mechanical logic. A lower center of gravity means less weight transfer in cornering, which means more consistent tire loading at all four corners. More consistent tire loading means faster corner speeds without the thermal degradation that destroys rubber and costs time in the closing laps. In 1988, with tire changes banned and Goodyear as the sole supplier, managing rubber across a full race distance was as important as outright downforce. Murray understood this. The MP4 was designed to be easy on tires, not just fast in a straight line. The problem was the Honda V6. The RA168E was not a small engine. Its longitudinal dimensions and the cooling requirements of a turbocharged unit with separate intercoolers imposed packaging constraints that seemed, initially, incompatible with Murray's ambitions. The solution came from a conversation between Murray and Honda's chief engine designer, Osamu Goto, that reportedly lasted an afternoon and resolved on a modification that Honda had never before agreed to for any customer team. The RA168E would be installed at a longitudinal incline tilted downward toward the rear of the car, allowing the overall roofline of the chassis to be dropped without compressing the cockpit or interfering with the turbocharger installation. The angle of inclination was small, approximately 3 degrees, but its effect on the car's external geometry was substantial. The MP4's roofline, measured at the driver's helmet, sat at approximately 895 millimeters from the ground. The Williams FW11B, the benchmark it was replacing as the car to beat, measured approximately 940 millimeters at the equivalent point. That 45-millimeter reduction in height, distributed across a wheelbase of 2,870 millimeters, changed every aerodynamic surface the car produced. The side pod inlets could be positioned lower and angled more acutely, improving cooling airflow pressure recovery without the drag penalty of vertical inlets. The airflow arriving at the undertray was more controlled, reducing the turbulence that causes inconsistent downforce at varying ride heights. And the diffuser, the rear underbody section that accelerates air rearward, creating a low-pressure zone that pulls the car toward the tarmac, could be shaped with a more aggressive expansion angle than the taller cars permitted. Downforce is not free. Every kilogram of it carries a drag penalty. The art of a fast Formula One car is not maximizing downforce, it is maximizing the ratio of downforce to drag, what engineers call aerodynamic efficiency. Murray's lower car achieved that ratio more cleanly than any McLaren before it. Multiplied across 300 kilometers of racing, it produces the kind of lap time margins that look, from the outside, like a different category of vehicle. This is the point where the simulation gap I described at the start becomes important, and where the story gets genuinely strange. Murray and Nichols had modeled the MP4's aerodynamics against a 40% scale wind tunnel model. When the car first ran at Imola in February, actual downforce figures exceeded the tunnel prediction by a margin that triggered an immediate audit of the testing methodology. The car was generating more grip than the model said it should. The investigation took weeks. The explanation, when it came, was that the interaction between the tilted engine installation, the lowered floor geometry, and the diffuser expansion ratio created a rear underbody flow condition that the scale model had not fully captured. At full scale, with real airflow velocities, the diffuser was working harder than predicted. Engineers use the word synergy carefully because it usually covers inadequate analysis. In this case, it was accurate. The car was better than its designers had planned for. That is a rarer occurrence than it sounds. Stay with this, because the engineering story cannot be separated from the human story, and the human story of the MP4 is one of the most complicated in the history of the sport. Ron Dennis had signed two drivers for 1988, Alain Prost, the reigning two-time world champion, and Ayrton Senna, who had just turned 28 and whose relationship with Prost over the following two seasons would define and ultimately fracture both of their careers. The conventional wisdom about two champions in equal machinery is that internal conflict destroys the team around them. In 1988, the opposite happened, not because Prost and Senna got along, but because they did not, and because that tension produced a quality of feedback and development pressure that a single dominant driver could never have generated alone. Prost was an optimizer. His method was to find the setup that produced the fastest average pace across a full race distance, managing tire degradation, fuel consumption, brake wear, and execute it with a mechanical precision that disguised how close to the limit he was operating. His lap times in the race were strikingly consistent, varying by fractions of a second across long stints. Senna was the inverse. His method was to find the absolute mechanical limit of the car's grip, exceed it in qualifying by a margin that still resists purely physical explanation, and trust that reflexes and spatial awareness would keep the car on circuit when physics said it should not be. At Jerez, he set a pole time 1.9 seconds faster than any rival. At Silverstone, 1.6 seconds. These are not competitive advantages, they are categorical separations. The McLaren engineers found themselves developing two distinct fuel maps and two setup philosophies that, when overlaid, told them more about the MP44's behavior envelope than any single driver's feedback could have provided. Senna's data showed them the absolute ceiling. Prost's data showed them how to approach that ceiling reliably, over race distance, with consistent tire temperatures and fuel burn rates. Together they created a development feedback loop of unusual richness, and the car that arrived at Suzuka in October was measurably more refined than the car that had appeared at Phoenix in March. The fuel constraint was the technical thread running beneath all of this, and it is the part of the story that receives the least attention from casual observers of the season. 150 litres of fuel for a race distance of approximately 300 kilometres. The Honda RA168E in race trim, running the conservative fuel map developed jointly with McLaren's engineers across the winter of 1987, produced between 620 and 650 horsepower, a figure that sounds modest compared to the qualifying output until you understand what it meant in the context of the restricted fuel allocation. No other turbo engine in the 1988 field could sustain competitive power output at 150 litres over a full race distance without either compromising pace in the closing laps or running out of fuel entirely. The Ferrari F187/88C was powerful, but consumed fuel at a rate that forced Berger and Alboreto into fuel conservation strategies that negated their straight-line speed advantage on power-sensitive circuits. The Megatron-engined Arrows team qualified respectably on occasion and routinely finished out of the points because their drivers spent the final 20 laps effectively coasting. Honda's advantage was not peak power. It was the efficiency curve, the ability to produce 85% of maximum power at 70% of maximum fuel flow that had been developed and refined through 3 years of racing with Williams, then handed exclusively to McLaren. By the fourth race of the season, the Monaco Grand Prix, the pattern was unmistakable. In qualifying, Senna set a time of 1 minute 23.908 seconds. Prost, in the second McLaren, was 1.427 seconds behind in second position. Gerhard Berger's Ferrari, the third fastest car on the grid, was 2.745 seconds off pole. On a circuit where rivals fight over hundredths of a second and a single tenth represents a meaningful advantage, the McLaren was operating in a separate performance window. It was not faster. It was categorically different. While leading in the final laps, Prost with an engine failure that arrived without warning on lap 35. Ferrari won at Monza, in front of 80,000 people who had been waiting all season for exactly this result, and the possibility of winning all 16 races was gone. 3 races into the Turbo era's final season, the perfect record had already been compromised. The championship was still Senna's, eventually, by 3 points over Prost, but it arrived through the kind of arithmetic that makes engineers wake up at 3 in the morning running alternative scenarios. That brings us to Suzuka, October 30th, 1988, the Japanese Grand Prix. The race where the championship would be decided and where everything that had been promised at the start of this video comes due. Senna stalled on the grid. Not a mechanical failure, not a technical problem, a procedural error in the pre-race preparation sequence that left the car motionless as the field formed up around him. He was pushed to the back of the grid and started the race from 14th position. In the first 7 laps, the MP44's performance was almost irrelevant. Senna was stuck in traffic, losing time to Prost, who had led from pole, falling further behind with every passing corner. And then, lap by lap, the car began to demonstrate exactly why Gordon Murray had tilted an engine 3 degrees in a Tokyo conversation 14 months earlier. The aerodynamic efficiency that the Imola tests had revealed allowed the MP44 to close the gap through corners where other cars could only follow the line. The fuel management that Honda had spent 18 months refining allowed Senna to push at a sustained pace that the cars in his way could not match. He passed Prost on lap 27. He led for the remaining 24 laps of the race and won by 13.363 seconds. When the car crossed the line and Senna brought it to rest in the Parc Fermé, he sat inside the cockpit for a long moment before climbing out. His race engineer, Giorgio Ascanelli, reported that Senna's voice on the radio when it came was not the voice of someone who had just won a world championship. It was quieter than that. At the end of 1988, the FIA banned turbocharged engines from Formula One entirely. The official rationale cited cost and safety. The real reason was competitive. The MP44 had demonstrated that the gap between the best turbo car and the best naturally aspirated entry, even under strict fuel and boost restrictions, was too large for a credible championship. The grid was shrinking. Smaller teams could not afford turbo development and could not compete on equal terms. Something had to change, and the regulations were the only lever available. The final figure. In 1988, the McLaren MP4 scored 199 championship points. Under the scoring system of the era, the theoretical maximum for a team, if both drivers had finished first and second in every race, was 240 points. McLaren left 41 points on the table. Senna's Monaco crash, the Monza retirements, Prost's engine failure, every one of those 41 points was lost to circumstance. Not a single point was lost because another car was faster. The MP44 exists today in the McLaren Heritage Collection at Woking. It runs under its own power. The Honda RA168E starts. The carbon fiber monocoque, designed without CAD on drawing boards in 1987, still holds its geometry within original tolerances. It is the most completely realized Formula One car ever built. Not the fastest in absolute terms. Not the most technologically complex of its era. That distinction belongs to the active suspension cars of the early 90s. The most complete, a machine in which engine, aerodynamics, driver management and operational execution aligned so precisely that the sport had to rewrite its fundamental technical regulations to bring it to an end. If you want to understand how Formula One actually works, not the races, but the decisions made in winter that determine who wins in summer, this channel is where that story gets told. Subscribe now, and in the next video we go inside the engineering decision that gave one team a 4-year aerodynamic advantage that the FIA failed to detect until the championship was already won. Leave your answer in the comments. Was the MP44 the greatest Formula One car ever built, Or does something else take that title? The conversation down there is worth having.